Hello, for those of you entering into the Zoom room and joining us today. You're here for the CBRL webinar on women's activism in the Levant. We're just going to give it a minute for people to enter. My name is Carol Palmer and I am the director of CBRL in Amman, Jordan, speaking to you from Amman today. And it's going to be my pleasure to introduce with my colleague in Jerusalem, Tawfiq Haddad, East Jerusalem, today's roundtable event with Islah Jad, Nicola Pratt and Sara Ababneh. And we're coming to you today from Amman, East Jerusalem and Ramallah via CBRL London. And it's fantastic to be able to start off today 2021's webinar series with CBRL with such a popular and topical webinar on, again, women's activism in the Levant for those of you joining us. And this is going to be a slightly different event in that it's a round table between our three speakers. I'm going to carry on talking while people are still entering to tell you a little bit about CBRL, Council for British Research in the Levant. For those of you who may not be familiar with our organisation, CBRL is an independent UK research charity and membership organisation that exists to conduct, support and promote humanities and social science research on the Levant, or Levantine Middle East. We're actually part of the British Academy's 7 or 8 British International Research Institutes, for which we receive a grant and aid to continue our operations in the region. But we're always grateful to the other organizations and individuals who support us in various ways through membership, through participating in our events as you are today. We run a number of events and additional research projects in our bases in Amman and East Jerusalem. But really the foci of our activities and what many will know us for are our institutes in the region. We have the Kenyan Institute in East Jerusalem, and the British Institute in Amman, or just Amman Institute, from where we're both joining you today. And I'm based in Amman, and my colleague who's going to be chairing, Tawfiq Haddad, is director of the Kenyan Institute in East Jerusalem. And we hope that you'll enjoy today's roundtable webinar and that you will join us for future events in 2021. Also to say that we have a back catalogue now of webinars that we started in 2020. And if you're not already on our mailing list, please do join us for information about future events. Now I'm going to hand over to Tawfiq to introduce today's roundtable event and our speakers. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Carol, for that introduction. And thank you to our panelists today for making themselves available. I think the overwhelming interest that we see online for this event speaks to how much interest there is out there and people searching out more. And I don't think that's just a consequence of the fact that this is 10 years to the since the quote unquote Arab uprisings began, but also all our three scholars who we have assembled today bring a wealth of knowledge of their respective areas of expertise. And for those who may be interested, we have had over 340 different people who signed up for this Zoom chat or Zoominar, which I think is a record for us. And we're very happy to bring this to the public to public viewing. So without further ado, and allow me to introduce my panelists today. We have, well, firstly, let me say today will be a roundtable event where we'll have 3 different scholars speaking on the subject of women's activism in the Levant. We have prepared 4 separate questions for all 3 panelists. And hopefully that should run around up to 50 minutes to 60 minutes. And then each panelist, of course, will be asked to respond and give roughly 4 to 5 minutes for an answer, focusing on their area of expertise and anything they see relevant beyond that. And then we have half an hour earmarked for additional questions from the audience. So please take your mental notes. Hope you have a cup of tea beside you so you can stay warm and listen to a very exciting coming roundtable. So as far as our upcoming the speakers, we have first Dr. Islah Jad, who's an associate professor at Birzeit University. It looks like she is in Victoria Gardens right now, but she is actually in Birzeit, or actually in Ramallah, or if yes, Ramallah area, shall we say. Dr. Jad is one of the founders of the Institute of Women's Studies at Birzeit, as well as the PhD program in social sciences, and is also a founder of the Women's Affairs National Coalition in the OPT. Her research focuses on Palestinian women's movements, gender and development in the Arab world, and women's political participation. Her book, Palestinian Women's Activism, which was published in 2018 by Syracuse University Press, was a shortlist for the Palestine Book Award in 2019. Our second panelist today will be Dr. Nicola Pratt, who is joining us today from, if I'm not mistaken, Warwick, or at least the UK, shall we say, or cyberspace. Dr. Pratt is a reader in international politics of the Middle East at the University of Warwick. She teaches and researches on the international politics of the Middle East, with a particular interest in feminist and decolonial approaches, as well as politics from below. She's an author of the recently published book, Embodying Geopolitics, Generations of Women's Activism in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, which recently came out from University of California Press in 2020. Our final panelist today is Dr. Sara Ababneh. Dr. Ababneh is an assistant professor and the head of the Social and Political Studies Unit at the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan. Her research focuses on gender, class, and struggles for social and economic justice. And her most recent article is entitled, "The Time to Question, Rethink, and Popularize the Notion of Women's Issues," between quotation marks, lessons from Jordan's popular and labor movement from 2006 to now. And that was published in the Journal of International Women's Studies and came out just this past year in 2020. So look up our panelists online, and I might also add that this is exclusively being broadcast on Zoom. It is not being broadcast elsewhere at this moment. So take your notes on the side if you need them. So I'm going to start off with the first question that I'm going to direct to Dr. Islah Jad, but will equally be directed at the other panelists and hopefully should form the basis of the discussion and the questions later on. So the first question that I'm asking all panelists will be, can you provide an overview of your research on women's activism, including the major findings and arguments? Take it away, Islah. And please get rid of your mute.
Yes, thank you, Tawfi, and thanks to Carol and Nicola for organizing such an stimulating panel. I am honored to be part of it, and I'm so happy to be one of the participants. To answer the question, let me start by saying that the conclusions or the arguments I made basically came out of my own activism within the Palestinian women's movement. What I argued and also concluded that the links and intersections of colonialism, nationalism, Islamism, and feminism in contemporary Palestine are all connected. So this is the general context from which we can draw some conclusions that colonialism affects a great deal the gender regime existing in any particular country, and in particular in Palestine. Colonialism affects the class formation, it affects the labor market, and it affects level of education, to whom to give education, to whom to deny or prevent from getting education. So colonialism is very important. And I'm raising this point that might sound, a bit out of context and old, but when we see occupations taking places in other countries around us, in Iraq and in Syria, in Libya, and in other countries, so we might bring back the question of colonialism and occupation again when we talk about the context in which women activism take place. The other point I tackled also about, it was the tension and conflicts within Palestinian nationalism that followed class and region and gender lines, from which women were supported to join the national movement, and also constrained by the same national movement when their gender issues were ignored. But women had to, through activism, they had to take in hands, what are the issues they need to push forward, and also to tackle with the two agendas, the national agenda and the social agenda. So nationalism was very supportive as constraining in the same time. The third argument I developed was about the liberal notion on liberal notion on NGOs and the boundaries and the power of civil society in affecting a radical change in our societies. So through my work, I showed the limitation of this liberal claim that NGOs are more inclusive, more close to the constituencies, more movable, more energetic. I showed through my work that that was not the case, and I showed how negatively the NGOization process that followed the Oslo Agreement affected the homegrown women's movement and a homegrown version of feminism that combined the national issues with the feminist issues. And the last argument I made about these dichotomies between conservative and liberals, between traditional and modernist, between Islamist and secularist, and I tried to show the intermingling between these concepts and how each one constitutes the other, and how the Islamists in the Palestinian context learned a great deal from the sort of activism, discourses, and some sort of gender ideology from the so-called Palestinian nationalist secularists to make a space for themselves and dominate the activism in the civil society in the face of the Oslo, after Oslo Palestinian Authority. So I just tried to show that Islamism is not out of context, in the Palestinian national struggle, and how they nationalized Islam and how they Palestinized, their activism to suit the Palestinian context and deconstruct this dichotomy between Islamists and secularists. And I stop here.
Well, thank you. You certainly said a lot there, and yeah, very, very, very insightful. Thank you, Dr. Islah. I'll take the question now to Dr. Pratt. Where are you, Dr. Pratt? Are you there? Looks Ooh, where'd she go, Nicola? Well, maybe something happened to her. I will use the opportunity now. We'll try and get her back online to direct the question at Dr. Ababneh. Are you there, Sara?
I am.
Fantastic. Go ahead, take it away. The question, can you provide an overview of your research, including some of the major findings and arguments?
Sure. So first of all, I really want to thank everyone for coming. I know for some of you from the US, it's really, really early, and thank you so much. So my research in terms of women's activism has been kind of around two themes. On the one hand, looking at the Jordanian women's movement, and on the other hand, looking at social movements, other movements, labor movements, who have a very high number of women. And the questions that come out of that research for me are, firstly, how do we understand women's rights activism? When we say women's issues, which qadaya al-mar'a in Arabic, in the singular, what do we usually mean when we say that? How do we define it? Based on whose experience, who's being included, who's being excluded? And how has this kind of this discourse around women's rights, how has it been depoliticized? How have women been seen as separate from their communities? How have women's issues become these separate issues versus national community issues? So in something about the activism, I guess, in my research, is kind of trying to repoliticize women's issues and bring it back to kind of, yeah, the more radical, I guess. And I'll stop here because I want to say more to the other questions.
Okay, Sara. Well, it appears that Dr. Pratt is not online or is having some kinds of difficulties. So we won't wait for her. Oh, hang on. She just popped up. Nicola, do you hear us?
I can't, yeah.
Yeah?
Sorry, I had internet problems, but
Okay.
I've moved closer to the router now, so hopefully it'll be okay.
Bless, just in time.
Am I just in time for my spot?
Just in time, just in time. Yeah, we were going to have to ad-lib something. No, it's all good. So actually, Sara filled in for you the last minute or two. And now the question is to you, posed to you. Can you provide an overview of your research and some of its findings and arguments?
Sure, okay. So before I start, I just want to say, to tell everybody about the image that's been used to advertise or publicize this event. The image is courtesy of Marwa Najjar, who's a really talented artist who is based, I think, between Jordan and the Gulf. Anyway, so this is one of her paintings, and you can see lots of other images by her on her Instagram account. And it's also an image that she's allowed me to use for the cover of my recent book. So thank you, Marwa. Okay, so with regards to the question, I mean, in the past, I've worked on women's activism in Iraq, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just going to focus on the more recent work I've done that's the basis for my recently published book, which is on women's activism in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. So this book is based on personal narratives of women activists speaking about their lives and their activism. And the book seeks to link the personal to the geopolitical, using women activists' experiences as lenses through which to understand the gendered dimensions of geopolitics. So it's an intervention into not just gender studies, but also critical geopolitics or critical international relations. So I collected over 100 narratives, or 100, or let's say I did 100 interviews with women who, from Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. And these women were from diverse fields of activism, not just women's rights activism, but also working in the fields of welfare and charitable work, political activism, trade unionism, and NGOs. I try to interview both secular-oriented and Islamist women. In Lebanon, I interviewed not only Lebanese women, but also Palestinian women. And in Jordan, many of the women I interviewed were of Palestinian descent. So through their stories, the book maps the changes in women's activism, as well as the shifts in women's subjectivities and identities over time, particularly in relation to significant geopolitical turning points. So the geopolitical turning points that are the focus of the book are decolonization, the Arab defeat in the 1967 war, the end of the Cold War, and of course the Arab uprisings and their aftermath. So on the one hand, I try to uncover stories that remain marginalized, if not totally absent in much of the scholarly literature on geopolitics in the Middle East and North Africa, such as the important contribution of women's unpaid work in the fields of social welfare and humanitarian work, and the importance of this unpaid work to post-independence state building. But I also point out the ways in which geopolitical upheavals, such as the 1967 war and the Arab uprisings, reshaped women's subjectivities and provided openings for women to challenge dominant gender norms through their involvement in revolutionary and radical movements. I don't treat personal narratives merely as objective historical sources that may present previously hidden or marginalized histories. Drawing on the work of feminist historians such as Luisa Pasarini and Molly Andrews, I use personal narratives to reveal the meanings of past events, and in this way to uncover the relationship between the self and memory, between the present and the past, between the individual and the collective, and particularly between the individual and the wider socio-political and geopolitical context. So this is a really important finding from the book, which is the significance of context in understanding women's activism. I contextualize women's narrative in relation to post-colonial state projects of national sovereignty and modernization and their gendered underpinnings, which have their roots in experiences of colonial domination and resistance to colonial discourses. By examining women's activism over several decades, my research has historicized the relationship between women's agency, gender, and the geopolitical, revealing how a particular configuration of space and power in a specific historical period is not only contingent and temporary, but is naturalized through a specific gender order. So the narratives of women activists are really important in revealing the gendered and spatialized relations of power, and that these gendered and spatialized relations of power also shape women's activism. So my overall argument is really about the importance of seeing women's activism as a form of embodied geopolitics, that women activists are geopolitical actors, and that understanding women's activism within that geopolitical context is very important for understanding wider contemporary politics and international relations in the Middle East.
Thank you, Nicola, for that. Okay, a lovely overview of your work there and some of your arguments. We're going to turn to the second question, which tries to address the question of what the main challenges that women activists in the Levant face based upon your research. And we'll do the same with Islah starting off, followed by Sara, then Nicola. Go ahead, Islah. You take your mute off.
Thank you, Tawfiq. Talking about challenges, we are facing so many challenges, in fact. First of all, is the a question about, you know, the relationship between activism, women's activism, and the occupying power. And the question is, can an occupying power destroys a whole country and liberate women in this country? So the issue or the challenge is how women could play a more active role in fighting and in struggling against occupation powers in the region, stopping wars and conflict. And here I have in mind, you know, the sort of activism of women in Latin America, especially in Chile and Argentina, when they, you know, in the face of dictatorship, they formed these groups as mothers to stop the killing and kidnapping and illegal imprisonments of their son. We don't have this in our region yet. So the second point is about how to challenge, you know, the women economic marginalization in our region, which I see the core reason for women dependency on men in our area. We still have very low level of economic participation in the region. And we have this contradictory phenomena that women get more education and get more unemployment in the labor market. So this is the second challenge. The third is how women's activism move from the one issue or the few issues on concerning women's interests and rights to join mainstream resistance and activism. I mean, how to move from issues, you know, related to women to a mainstream social movement. And I have in mind now the focus on, you know, violence against women, and which I call the one issue activism, you know, how to link these different issues to a comprehensive resistance and struggle to gain women's power within the mainstream resistance in our countries. Another issue is how to link women's activisms and their struggle for their rights with other issues. I'm so happy to hear more from Sara about how to link women's rights issues with workers' rights, with teachers' rights, with peasants' rights. We still feel that we are in separated compartments, and we cannot realize the old slogan of tout soutien in the Marxism in the past. So we still fragmented around, you know, separate issues to struggle for. Of course, one of the major challenges for women's activism in the region also is how to bridge the gap between urban and rural divides, especially with the privatization of most of the public education, and the elite gets private education, which is very up to date and very advanced in its material infrastructure and its content, while the majority of the people are left to deprived and poor public schooling that can barely give the minimum of education for the masses. Another challenge is the how to engage actively and productively with conservative groups and discourses. And I say conservative groups in general, not necessarily coming from any religious groups or whatever, because conservatism is also among, you know, non-religious people. And the final issue is how to root the universal packages of women's rights within, you know, local, within the local context and be part in the same time of a transnational feminist movement, especially in the South. This is how I see the challenges.
Thank you, Islah. I'm going to turn to Sara now. I know you actually gave quite a short answer last time, so I'll give you a couple of extra minutes this time, but let's be on point. Go ahead, take it away.
Thank you. So if you had asked me the question, what are the main challenges? So I'm going to focus on Jordan in this question. And if you had asked me about this question, what are the main challenges facing Jordanian women's rights activists in the 1950s, I would have said security services harassment, potentially getting kicked out of one's job, and in the worst case scenario, death. Fortunately, that's no longer the case for women's rights activists in Jordan. However, I think that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that there has been such a rift in between women's rights activists and popular activists. Workers, the women and men who went onto the streets in 2011, 2012 in the Jordanian popular movement. And what I want to look at now is why there is this rift. So if you look at the literature will say the rift is due to two main things: the way the women's movement has evolved historically, and the biggest kind of shaping factor of this women's movement has been the state. So state interference, state surveillance, the way the state acted with the women's rights movement. And that is usually seen as the main reason why women's rights activists or the women's movement has kind of moved the way it has. But I actually think there's another thing that is probably not, those two reasons are there and they have impacted the women's movement, but there's actually something more, which is discourse. There has been a shift in discourse, not just in Jordan, but internationally, and how we see women's issues and how we see women's rights. And that is what I want to unpack right now. I'm going to share with you, I hope I can do this without too much. Okay, share this. Let's see. So if we look at the discourse, I think the discourse, there are three elements that have changed. Firstly, how we define women's issues, and I'm going to unpack that in a second. Then what Islah Jad calls NGOization, the NGOization of the women's movement. And finally, looking at women's rights and seeing them through the lens of development. And I'm going to unpack all three now. So first, let's start with what are women's issues? قضايا المرأة. Generally, when we speak about women's issues, we're talking about gender-based violence, legal discrimination, political disempowerment, and economic disempowerment. All of these are usually seen in a very individualistic way. So gender-based violence is domestic violence. It is not the violence of not having adequate schooling. And where the majority of Jordanians say that when they went to school in the winter, they could not feel their fingers from the cold. And of course, the boy child and the girl child have been affected very differently by that in terms of the violence that is inflicted on the boy child's body in these public schools. And in terms of the girl child, often, what happens to her body not being able to go to the bathroom for 12 hours or for 8 hours in the day. So, but that type of violence is not part of how gender-based violence is understood. Gender-based violence is generally understood as domestic violence against women. Mostly, sometimes the boy child, but mostly women and the girl child. Then, of course, there's legal discrimination, which is basically the personal status law, family law. And when we speak about political disempowerment, we generally mean that there aren't enough women in the political institutions. We don't talk about democratization in a bigger way. We don't talk about wider issues. We talk about very specifically the lower house, which for anyone who knows Jordan knows that the lower house does not have that much power. I've written economic disempowerment in a smaller font because it often doesn't feature. It's something that sometimes features. And when it features again, it is not structural. We're talking about individual. So in a household, do women have to give their salaries to their husbands or fathers? That's the kind of violence, economic violence that we talk about when it's on this list. So women's issues, again, to summarize, is a list, an invisible list that most organizations working on women's rights have in their heads, and then they'll fund certain things based on this list. So how did we come up with this list? Let me now kind of look historically at how the women's movement has evolved and how it has shifted in terms of discourse. If we look at the beginning of the women's movement, the recorded beginning, which is usually from 44 to 50, we see a mainly elite group of women based in Amman who are very close to the palace, upper class women who work with mothers mostly, and it's mostly charity work. And of course, discursively, this is very similar to what was happening around the globe, whether in North America or in Europe, around the beginning of the 20th century. Then when we come into the 50s, I call it the radical years, we have decolonization, we have nationalism, and the Jordanian women's movement, which was very close to the Palestinian women's movement, really worked on national independence, on women getting the right to vote, being part of the nation, mostly pan-Arab nation, but also, being able to vote, being able to fight. And together with everyone else, when martial law was declared in Jordan in 1957, the women's groups were shut down as well, and they had to go underground because they were seen as a political threat. Now in the 1970s, we have an increased interest again in women's rights, because in 1971, there was the declaration that the year 1975 was going to be International Women's Year. And of course, Jordan wanted to appear to be at the forefront of the state's fight for women's rights. So women's organizations were allowed to organize again. And the state started taking an active interest. And this is where we have like the entrance of state feminism. But with that, there was a de-radicalization, I want to say more than that, a depoliticization of women's rights, in that we had initially in Jordan, women's groups had to sign up with the Ministry of Interior, which is the ministry that is the real kind of where real politics happens. And what happens once the state starts taking interest, and of course this is again happening globally, this is not something that is particular to Jordan, is that we then have the Ministry of Social Affairs, later the Ministry of Social Development, becoming the umbrella organization. So what happens is there's a shift in understanding women's rights and struggles from one of politics to one of the social. And this is a significant shift. The shift afterwards that happens is from 1989 to 2018, I want to say roughly, which is when, so 1989 is when Jordan, quote unquote, democratizes. But then, at the same time, globally, this is the end of the Cold War and kind of the victory of capitalism and the emergence of NGOs. And this is what leads to kind of, I think, the phase that we're still very much in, which is NGOization. And I want to now unpack NGOization as defined by Islah Jad, to really, so we can understand what I'm talking about. So Islah Jad writes, NGOization denotes the process through which issues of collective concern are transformed into projects. So the first thing that happens is that we have a collective issue, a national issue, a communal issue, something that affects all of us. And that is compartmentalized and is made small and is made into a tiny project. Into projects in isolation from the general context in which they are implemented, and without taking into consideration economic, social, and political factors affecting these projects. So let me give you an example from Palestine. Palestine, we know a lot of organizations, children's rights organizations, work with children who have been jailed in Israeli jails, and they provide post-traumatic relief, counseling, etc. Now, this is important because these children have been traumatized, but these organizations do not go and say the problem is the occupation, settler colonialism has to stop. They basically, what they do is they deal with the wounds. There are wounds, these wounds have to be tended, but they don't deal with what causes these wounds, with what actually is constantly, reopening these wounds. Let me go back to the quote. It also denotes a shift in women's activism from voluntarism to dependence on foreign funding. So we're not talking about something that I do because I believe in it and that I do as part of what I, without pay. We're talking about something that becomes, is initiated by foreign funding. A shift in the personnel dealing with women's empowerment from grassroots, ruler and refugee cadres to middle-class urban elites of professionals. So we're not talking about the people who are affected, who are leading this, but we're talking about professionals, people the likes of me who come in with Western education, who have the right credentials, who come in as experts and who come and solve the problem, the mathematical problem. So this is one of the things that happened discursively in terms of how we conceptualize women's rights, but and also then led to how we practice it on the ground. This then also leads to something else, and it's part of a wider phenomenon, which is basically seeing women's rights or seeing the problem of women as a problem of development. What does that mean? That means that I'm no longer talking about women's rights. I'm no longer talking about structures that are affecting women. What I'm saying now is there's a problem in a particular community, in a particular society, because they are underdeveloped. They are not developed enough. Their culture, their religion, something is not right and needs to be it needs to be developed. So the problem is with the community itself, and mostly men in the community. So because of this culture, because of this religion, these men in these communities often oppress the women in these communities. So what happens with this development framework is, firstly, we turn the flashlight around and we blame communities for their own predicament without looking at any structural effect. But then we also blame the men in these communities for the oppression of the women in these communities, and we pit them against each other. So women's issues become divorced from men's issues. Or from wider community issues. So this, if we go back to saying why were women's rights organizations not there in 2011, 2012, protesting on the streets with everyone else in Jordan, it is because these people who were protesting, people from refugee camps, people from villages, these kind of men who are protesting, and women, they are seen as the patriarchs who are oppressing women. So they're actually seen as what these women's rights activists want to resist. And this is basically, I think, so the discursive really shows us how leads us to the biggest problem, which also Islah Jad just talked about, which is we cannot conceptualize wider national issues in terms of women's rights. We cannot gender them. We're not able to. The discourse doesn't allow us to. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sara. Okay, now turning to Dr. Nicola. Judge, based on your book, can you give us some insight as well on some of the greatest challenges that women activists in the Levant face today? Or maybe actually, because you have a historical perspective, you might want to add that too. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think that the question did also point to sort of the historical have faced, but never mind. Just to follow on from Sara, I think, the process of change in the Jordanian women's movement that she has identified through different periods is something that also resonates with what I found. And I think what I would say, though, is I think it's also really important to understand why that happened. And in particular, if we're looking at because similar processes have happened in women's movements across the region, as Islah has demonstrated in her work on NGOization of the women's movement in the Arab world. And I think, these changes were embedded within particular geopolitical contexts and sort of geopolitical shifts that were happening. And in particular, this, for example, in the 1970s, initially there was, after the 1967 war, initially there was a sort of flourishing radical activism, very much tied to the PLO, and the Palestinian national movement had a very important role in mobilizing, in particular, young women in the Palestinian refugee camps, but also women more broadly. And then the reaction against that, I mean, there was a strong reaction at the level of not just the Jordanian regime, but more widely across the region and internationally to defeat these radical movements. In Lebanon, it ended in a civil war. And there was also conflict in Jordan. And this had a really profound impact, I found, on women's activism, because many women became demobilized, if you like, as a result of the huge repression of the Palestinian national movement and the associated leftist and other radical nationalist movements that were around in that time. And it's partly, that repression not only impacted on women's activism, but it impacted on social movements in general. So that delinking that Sara talked about, the delinking of women's movements from other popular movements, occurred not because there was some sort of strategic choice amongst activists to do that, but popular movements themselves were in abeyance, and therefore women activists who were associated with those movements became they became isolated because they were no longer, or that these radical movements had been suppressed. And it's really, I guess, a testament to the resilience of women's activism, that despite this wider political repression in society, women were nonetheless able to continue their activism. And of course, this is also where it intersects then with the changes at the international level at the end of the Cold War, and this sort of new consensus around women's rights and the Beijing conference. But the other thing I would say is that in the interviews that I did, also many of the women from that sort of leftist backgrounds who were involved in radical movements in the 1970s and 80s, they also abandoned, to the degree that they were perhaps working underground, they abandoned a lot of those movements and parties because of the lack of attention given by male leadership to women's issues. So there was both a process of political repression that pushed women out of these movements, well, largely because they started to become so weak, but also the problem was in these movements themselves was also a factor that pushed women to start to focus more on women's issues. But of course, as Sara has very eloquently discussed in her presentation, that discourse has become, that discourse that emerged in the post-Cold War era was a very depoliticized discourse. I think I've probably run out of time, haven't I, Tawfiq?
Sure. Don't worry. But good points. Lots of very interesting points, but lots of intersections, and we're getting a very nuanced, rich picture that's sort of emerging here. We're going to turn to our third question of the panel today, which has to do with what our panelists feel are the most important achievements of women's activists in the Levant. Take it away, Islah. Actually, put on your mic. There you go.
Thank you, Tawfiq. If we go back to what Qasim Amin, in the turn of the 2020, at the beginning of the 20th century, was advocating for women. He was asking for education and women to be part of the public space. and to be treated, you know, as an able person, an able mind, you know, and provide their societies with their, you know, capabilities. So after almost a century now, after Qasim Amin, we can say that women in our region achieved very good level of education in most of our countries. Even though some Arab countries still have high percentage, you know, of illiterate women. So number one achievement would be education. Number two will be, you know, breaking the stereotypes that men can do, women cannot. So we can see women pioneers in many fields of professions, in communication and media, in engineering, in medicine, in different fields that, you know, these pioneers broke the stereotype about women, you know, that they cannot do most of men's professions. So we have images of women in all the fields, sports, different economic activities, politicians, etc. What we achieved also is a huge number of organizations working to support other women in different fields. Yes, we might, you know, conceptualize some organizations in different ways as charitable or as NGOs or whatever, but we have lots of women who were also pioneers, as much as the social constraints sometimes allow them, you know, who provided an vital assistance to women in the fields of education, in medical support, psychological support. So we have women volunteering and pioneering in different voluntarism or activities out of voluntarism. And here I cannot imagine, for example, the Palestinian society after 1948, when you have hundreds of orphans, you know, lost from their parents in the streets, or just abandoned, you know, children. You know, many women came, you know, at the forefront to provide vital and important support for these children, and sometimes to their parents and their families too. The last point, which is not very, you know, very stable, I can say that we can witness some sort of political presence to some women. But as Sara, you know, mentioned earlier, with the prevailing, you know, despotism in our region, women still in this political arena are seen as something to beautify an ugly system. So we do have lots of women politically active. Some of them are brought up by the dictatorships. Some are in the prisons of these dictators, and some are, you know, volunteering against all odds. But the idea is that women see themselves as political actors, and they do try, you know, to sustain this activism as much as their time and tasks allow them, and also the context of democracy or lack of democracy that is prevailing in our region. These are the most important achievements I can speak about.
Thank you, Islah. Moving on to Sara, if you'd like to speak to the most important achievements in the Jordanian context.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's very, very similar. I was going to start with the same things if we think about education, health. I mean, we have gender parity in terms of education in Jordan. In fact, when it comes to university education, we have more women who are university educated than men. Now, this is not just because of women's rights activists, of course. The state actually has played a big role in this too, and there are some benefits to state feminism. Or gender mainstreaming. But the women's movement has also worked a lot in terms of course, in terms of the wars, 48, but also more recently in terms of legal reform, building shelters for survivors of gender-based violence, providing free legal aid, something that is not a right in Jordan. And a lot of people suffer from not having access to. Working with women in prison, supporting female parliamentarians. But most of all, and I think this is the kind of the important point, is that there is now an entire sector, there's a lobbying group for women's issues, where otherwise there would be, there would be nobody to actually say, where are the women, where's gender? So on that level, there has been a lot of work. Also in terms of the kind of community-based organizations that are all over. And I am generally critical of, the funding of them, etc. But through my research, I've had interviewees say to me, look, these organizations have changed my life. I have been able to work, I have been able to find myself through these organizations. And I think we need to remember that. And I think this is something that it is easy to criticize. And there are definitely things to criticize, but it is also important to mend the wounds. Even when you can't get rid of whoever is inflicting the wounds, somebody needs to mend them. And I think the women's movement in Jordan has been doing this and have been, and have been kind of lobbying for women. And again, I'm going to stop now because I want to say more for the last question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Nicola, your thoughts?
Okay. Great. So I think I'd begin by saying that the question of achievement, it does sort of speak to this narrative that we often want to hold on to as one of progress. And we want to be able to celebrate progress. And I think that if you look at women's activism over sort of a long historical trajectory, and you also think about women's activism as having effects on multiple scales. So it's not just that women's activism can have impacts on gender relations, or it can have impacts on the state, but rather that it can have, there are multiple scales and there can be differential impacts at those scales. So I think what I've tried to do in my work is to caution against a narrative of, if you like, progress, achievement, or to see things in binary terms, either something's a success or an achievement, or it's a failure, or because because of the way in which women's activism, I see it as having two elements, if you like, to it. There's the discursive element of women's activism in terms the types of discourses that are adopted by women or the way in which women frame their activist objectives. And Sara's presentation focused a lot on, sort of post-Cold War women's rights discourse. The other element of women's activism that I think is also really important is actually women's embodied presence in the public sphere. And the reason for that is because, first of all, historically, first of all, anti-colonial nationalist movements and then post-colonial state building projects put a big premium, if you like, a big emphasis on women's visibility in the public sphere as a marker of national modernity. And therefore, that's why, for example, you have state feminism. That's one of the reasons why some of the successes, the biggest successes that we see in terms of gender relations is regards to women's access to education and women's participation in the workforce. And it's so, but at the same time, women have also had to bear the burden of representation of cultural authenticity. And the Iranian historian Afsaneh Najmabadi, she has a really pithy way of describing how sort of expectations around women's participation in the public sphere. Women have been expected to be modern yet modest. So in my work, I've called this sort of the norm of female respectability that has regulated women's activism, and in different periods. So women have either sort of worked around that norm, they've both leveraged it in terms of the legitimacy it gives to women's public participation, but they've at the same time, that's often meant also a compliance with that aspect of modesty. But in moments of big geopolitical upheaval, such as in the Arab uprisings, when social norms become destabilized, as well as sort of social and political structures, that has given women a huge opportunity to challenge those dominant gender norms of female respectability, and both through discourse and through their embodied presence in the public sphere. So the actual participation of so many women in the demonstrations, in the mass demonstrations that we saw 10 years ago, but we've seen since then in Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan. These are really important also in terms of challenging hegemonic gender norms. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nicola. We have our last question for tonight, but before we actually do that, I'd like to remind folks in the audience, if you have any questions, to put them in the question and answer field. We'll do a last round with our panelists today, asking them all the question about what they see are looking towards the future, what they see are the most important trends coming up in women's activism across the Levant. Go ahead, Islah. And don't forget your mic.
Okay, thank you, Tawfi. I think this is the most difficult questions when you try to answer about, trends in the future, and the picture around you is really so bleak, I mean, since more than 150 years, we are struggling to have more freedom in our region, that the people could have more say in their governance, in their, in setting their objectives at all levels. But it is, becoming very bleak. And as I said at the beginning, the region witnessed a new wave of occupation and colonialism in the day life. So to foresee some emerging trends, I could speak about, since the space for general liberties is shrinking and very minimal, we are witnessing a new wave of new forms of resistance coming from cultural and artistic backgrounds. So we see new forms of expression in cinema, songs, novels, performances, in whether through dance. I can talk about, you know, the spreading of many dance groups in the Palestinian context, rappers, people expressing their views in cinema, and it could be seen as a very important weapon, especially if we follow the you know, the last court of of the film Jenin that was confiscated and banned by an Israeli court, and the producer was fined to pay something like $150,000 as a fine. So I can see that a cultural resistance and these new forms of cultural resistance is getting so important. It gives, you know, the activists a space, you know, not to be in direct challenge with the political oppressive context, but it gives also a medium for expression. The other trend I am seeing and I can talk about is a role of women in the diaspora. And when we see the also the shrinking space for freedom of expression in the Palestinian context right now, how the Palestinian Authority is surveying, you know, social networks, surveying political activism, surveying different or different forms of expression, we see that activists in the diaspora are playing a very important role in setting the common right for the national struggle of the Palestinian people and deconstructing the confinement of the Oslo agreement and the confinement of the Israeli practices on the ground. So women in the diaspora organize all sorts of activities, conferences, demonstrations, raising slogans, directing, you know, the agenda for the national struggle. So these are the main two trends I can talk about, and I wish I could talk more about more, you know, positive trends.
Bless Islah. Thank you. I pose the question to Sara now. Go ahead. What you see as the most important trends coming up?
Yeah, I'm gonna share again. Oh, sorry, I went and where did? Sorry, I'm not the most technologically apt person. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm gonna start with Jordan, but I'm gonna move out of Jordan. In Jordan, I do think there has been a shift in the recent years. In 2018, there was a huge national outcry against a new taxation law. It happened Ramadan and started from the unions and was really kind of all across the classes. And what we saw with this is that women, I mean, first of all, it was women and men. So in terms of the protesters, it was absolutely gender mixed, but also we did see some of the main women's rights activists on the streets. Now, they were there in their individual capacity, but the reason they were there in their individual capacity is because by that time, the Jordanian state had forced all women's rights organizations to become part of the Ministry of Social Development, which means that they are, by law, not able to participate in any work that is the work of political parties, quote unquote. So anything that's vaguely political, they're actually not allowed to participate in as an organization. So there's no wonder that they weren't there in their kind of, as groups. They would have been shut down. But they were there every night. And they also, the women's movement and women's activists really participated in showing the effect, the gendered effect of the taxation law. How it affects single women, how it affects married women, who gets more. So there was a lot of awareness raising. However, on a whole, it did not really lead to gendering the protests. So the national kind of protest of taxation in the general public, there was this understanding that it's also a women's issue. Moving forward in 2019, the teachers' union went on strike, and the women's movement, a lot of the main activists supported the teachers' union. They actually were in charge of writing a document by all civil society organizations supporting the union. And this is something where the government really going kind of head to head with the union. That was a very brave thing to do, just standing out there and saying, no, we're in support of the union. But again, the demands of the union, the right to unionize, the right to have more than a minimum wage, the ability of education to not be privatized, to be a national right, all of that was not gendered. Again, it was still kind of seen as a national issue. So let me contrast this a little bit with the wider Arab scene. Like Nicola has said, there have been a lot of protests recently. And of course, women have been at the forefront. They have become icons to these protests, whether in Sudan or in Iraq. In Lebanon, we have this quote, which reads, "Al-adala al-iqtisadiyya qadiyya nasawiyya." Economic justice is a feminist issue. Also from Lebanon, we have صراعنا طبقي مش طائفي. Our struggle is a class struggle, not a sectarian one. So we really have a shift in discourse, trying to say these national issues are also women's issues. We are reclaiming what has been happening. And I know there are already some questions about the kind of the role of imperialism and how detrimental it has been to women's movements on the ground by Francis and by others. So I think we can speak to that later on as well. And then, as Sylvia and others have said, of course, we have Tal'at. And Tal'at, I think, is a great example of something that, again, is not foreign to the Palestinian scene, because Palestinian women's rights activists have been struggling to unite the national with the women's issue with the national in various forms and at various times in history. But Tal'at basically appears in September 2019 after a very ugly so-called honor killing, where a group of women all over historic Palestine come out and say this needs to stop. But unlike the dominant discourse on Palestine, which loves to support Palestinian women when it's the Palestinian men who are the violators, and we talk about Palestinian women as if they're Norwegian women, as if the only problem that they have is that they're being beaten up by their men inside the home. And like that kind of discourse, Tal'at were very, very clear, saying, yes, we are not going to be silent about domestic violence, but domestic violence is connected to the occupation, to settler colonialism. These are part and parcel. And so kind of really, and coming together and saying that. So for example, we have here, this is on Corona. So this is something that Tal'at has written on Corona. They've said, it is occupation and Corona and the patriarchal structure that is killing us. So kind of really, bringing things together. Our hearts are with those who are in lockdown in violent homes. The issue is not an issue of the family, it's an issue of society. But again, not an issue of society. I mean, it's a much more complex discourse that brings together forms of marginalization, but also forms of how to liberate oneself. And then here we have, for example, Hajar an Hajar bifri. One way of lockdown is different from another. So saying that, you're saying to us, we should abide by the rules of the pandemic, but real prevention has to have a secure home and water, and you cannot have an occupation and a settler colonial state and be secure. So it's not, and just again, bringing everything together. So future trends. So I think on the Arab scene, things are changing. In Jordan, there has been a shift. There has been a shift. Women's rights activists have started joining other activists on the streets with wider national discourses, national struggles, economic struggles too. However, the discourse has not changed. We still are talking about the national without women in it. There are no women. We don't see gender when we talk about the national. And we don't see the national when we talk about women's issues. The two don't meet. We talk about women's oppression, and we don't see how economic marginalization, economic oppression, and economic violence form a certain type of women's oppression. So there's still this depoliticized discourse that separates these discourses. And finally, we don't have Ahl al-Qadiyya. The people of the cause are not leading the cause. We still have upper middle class women leading and speaking for other women, and they're trying to hear, but because it doesn't come from their own experience, they're not able to bring in the subject positions that are necessary to understand the complexities of different forms of marginalization that fall. So I think what needs to still happen, other than gendering the national, is also for those, the majority, to actually start leading, and for it to kind of come back and, you know, to kind of politicize women's issues again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Nicola, any final words from you about the emerging trends?
Yes. Sara made many of the points that I had also been thinking about in terms of the increased visibility of young women in these very important sort of national protest movements, whether in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, and also the increasing intersectional discourse of young feminists that weave together the national and the personal and the political, if you like, the national and the gender issues. What I would, I guess, add is perhaps just a reflection on how COVID-19 will impact the trajectory of women's activism. It's a bit too soon to say, perhaps, but I think, like major geopolitical upheavals in the past, which were a catalyst for or created an enabling environment for women to challenge dominant gender norms and gender discourses, I think potentially COVID-19 could have that a similar sort of impact, because the way in which women are bearing a disproportionate burden of care work as a result of COVID-19, you know, the increased amount of social reproductive work that women are having to do in the home, the way in which, because of the gendered labour market, many women, for example, in the nursing profession, who are at the front lines of being, you know, vulnerable to being infected by COVID. So COVID-19 has this potential also to politicize things like social reproductive work that previously, perhaps for a lot of women, were just seen as the norm. And I think there's a potential there to mobilize new constituencies of women if there emerges sort of clear discourse around these sort of issues of social reproduction and division of labour within the home, which until now has tended to be, I mean, challenging sort of gendered hierarchies within the home has tended to be something that a lot of women activists have not really engaged with, because of the sort of potential hostile reaction from conservative elements in society. But I think, so that for me is an interesting thing to see how COVID-19 might be opening up possibilities for women to challenge gendered hierarchies within the home and open up these questions of social reproduction to politicization in a way that they haven't done until now.
Thank you, Nicola. Fantastic panel discussion. We are going to turn now to our audience members and the questions that they have posted. I remind audience members to go to the question and answer icon rather than the chat to pose their questions. Now, obviously, this is going to be a bit difficult because there's kind of Zoom overload going on these days, and we don't want to, kill our audience with dragging things on too long. We'd like to take it another 20 minutes if possible, but max there. And I'll try to synthesize my questions, remembering, of course, that we have 3 panelists who may or may not wish to answer the questions that are out there. So one question that I'm gonna, if the panel members give me a little liberty here to sort of play around with some of the questions and group them together. We had a question from an Annie Gregoire who thanked the panelists for their discussions, but also raised the question around the theme of NGOization, which seems to be fairly recurrent across our panelists. She asks, your criticisms of NGOization seem possibly in contradiction to the positive outcomes from NGO work to heal the wounds which Sara mentioned in her one of her presentations. The question is, how could we have the best of both politicized women's activism and social healing intervention work together? What would a better situation look like? So I'd like to sort of field that question to all of our panelists, if possible, to hear their thoughts on the vehicle of NGOs. Is it possible to have positive outcomes from this best of both worlds, or is it not the right mechanism overall? Thoughts, folks? I'll start with Islah there.
Thank you, Tawfi, and thanks for the question. It is a very important question. Yes, it does seem in contradiction, but the issue is that we were talking about different generations. When we talked about the generation of the 40s and the 50s, we were talking about the generation of so many charitable societies. And they were the dominant, strata of women during this time. Then came, an era of grassroots movement belonging to political parties and part of the national movement that were very hegemonic in their way of activism, their discourse about national struggle, about women's issues, and about emancipation at all levels, whether national or gender or whatever. So, and then we, after Oslo, we can speak about the generation of NGOs. And this elite, leading NGOs were very hegemonic to the point that they completely concealed over the discourse, the sort of activism, the achievement of the previous generations, and in the meanwhile, they were not, they didn't prove to be a new efficient medium to achieve the big slogans they were carrying, whether at the national level or at the emancipatory level for women in general. So if we talk about, these generational gaps or the generational differentiations, the picture will be maybe clearer. But right now we have very important examples of charitable organization providing vital services for women, and the example in mind in our area is in Ashil Usr, the rehabilitation of the family that provide important services to young women, and they provide education, health services, economic opportunities, etc. But the issue here is that they are not presenting themselves as, expressing all women's needs or all women's interests or all, you know, women's, you know, goals in general. So they are just doing their work voluntarily, quietly, efficiently, while there are other groups of women doing other things. The issue here is that, you know, the discourse hegemony, when you push a discourse that you are representing all women's, you know, needs and interests, and in reality, it is not the case. You see, so at least the generation of the charitable societies now, they are not claiming, you know, this big goal to achieve. I think.
Sara, you want to jump in there? Because the question was initially addressed to you, and you raised the issue of NGOization a fair amount in your talk as well. I don't want to prevent Nicola if she has thoughts, but we're going to Sara first. But mic on, please. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I think it's very important to keep in mind the historical dimension that Islah was talking about, but it's because it depends. At some, yes, like, do we ease the suffering? It's like the same as humanitarian aid. We need humanitarian aid. If a war continues, there's a need for it. But what if humanitarian aid comes from the very people who are bombing us? And of course, again, Palestine is probably the kind of most extreme example in terms of, for example, European aid. That then, you know, do we, like, when the Israelis bomb a street, do we want to leave it bombed? Or do we want it fixed? But then European aid goes and fixes it and then supports Israel, you know, Israel economically and politically. So they're connected, and often sometimes the connections aren't as clear. So, for example, for this legal aid, free legal aid that is happening in Jordan, I think this is very, very important. It really makes a difference in, like, the lives of hundreds of women and men. But we need to do this together. We cannot do it alone. I think this is important. And again, like with Talat, it's not like they are focusing on domestic violence, and it's important, but they discursively connect it to the rest. They don't allow this to become an isolated project. And I think Marta asked a question about that too, kind of how can we escape that? So I do think it's very important to keep pushing discursively and not going in. Even if we say, okay, I acknowledge I need to help, this person is thirsty, they need water, but we need to say the reason they don't have water is not just because the husband took the water. No, it's the state has been pumping this water out for the last 30 years. So we need to make these connections.
Nicola, do you want to jump in anything there, or we move to another question?
Yeah, I think we can move to another question.
Sure. Okay, well, perhaps picking up where Sara left off around the issue of discourse, because it came up in Francis Hasso's discussion or question, excuse me, which also links with Sivayika Sivani's, which has to do with trying to bring in the larger structural elements which may and their contributions to women's activism in the Levant. So Francis asks about if discourse is produced by ideological commitments, shouldn't this lead us to ask about national political economy and international racial capitalism and imperialism? And then Sivayika wants to sort of shine particular light on, can someone elaborate on the particular role of US intervention in Middle Eastern countries and how that's affected women? Perhaps maybe Nicola, you might want, we start off with you because you didn't say anything in the last question.
Okay, thanks. So briefly on the question of how US intervention in the Middle East has shaped discourses around women's rights. I mean, the effect has been very negative. There's been a backlash. In particular, the fact that, you know, the 2003 invasion, the US-led invasion of Iraq was done partly under the banner of liberating women, or empowering women, that created a huge potential for backlash against the notion of women's rights or women's participation in society. You know, in the earlier work that I did with Nadia Ali, that was something that clearly came out, that the challenge that women rights activists faced in trying to legitimize their claims for women's rights given the ways in which a lot of people in society associated women's rights with US imperialism. But looking more historically as well, I mean, colonialism, which Islah started off this evening by talking about colonialism and its impact on women and women's rights and women activists. I think there's an ongoing legacy from the experience of colonialism and the anti-colonial struggle that has made the issue of women's rights, women's bodies, particularly politicized. And so questions around women's rights are not just social questions. They're also questions that go to the heart of the bases for justification for regimes and states. I mean, whether that's the sectarian political system in Lebanon, or the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, or the regime in Egypt, gender has played a really important role. Women, or claims for women's rights, or particular types of women's rights versus not other types of women's rights, have played a really important role in legitimizing geopolitical structures of power. So and the root of that is, I think, in the way in which colonialism saw sort of politicized women and the situation of women in relation to colonial discourse and notions of women as the markers of culture and so-called Oriental backwardness. So and there are those ongoing legacies until today, this geopolitical logic around women's rights and women's bodies.
Sara or Islah, want to jump in there? Sara?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a very important question. It keeps haunting us, because it has US and European, whether you call it imperialism or what, it has been detrimental for women's rights activism on the ground from the time that, Lord Cromer famously said that the British were in Egypt to liberate Egyptian women, to, of course, like Nicola just said, the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, dead women aren't liberated women, they're dead, they're occupied. There's no, and this has been really detrimental. But also, and this is where, I mean, there's also, women's rights activist groups have taken money from organizations that are part and parcel of these regimes. The World Bank is a big donor, and a lot of women's rights activists don't have a problem taking money from them. So there is and that is what a lot of people on the ground say, well, look at you're, and this is where the rift between the popular movements and women's movements often is justified. But I think there's another thing, which is there's a wider discourse in which there is this idea that women are more oppressed in the Muslim and Arab world than anywhere else, and that the United States or the UK or anyone has a right to kind of tell us how to liberate women, when actually, when you look at the numbers, if you look at femicide, intimate partner violence, the highest numbers are in the United States and the United Kingdom, not in the Muslim Middle East. So why do you come here and start telling us, how not to kill our women when you have the same problem? And I think, again, here we need to also ourselves, as people working on the ground, reclaim and say, I'm sorry, no. If you want to work with me from the United Kingdom or the United States, let's do a joint project where we do a comparative project, where we see how this is here and this is there, so that, because the focus on our society, it almost leads you to think that this is a problem that's particular to here, where it's not. And this, I think, also kind of connects to what Islah was saying about solidarity and who you work with. It's not about, yes, now there's a lot of amazing work between Black Lives Matter, Native American activists, South African activists, Palestinian activists, and it's that kind of solidarity, seeing how these systems of oppression are similar and how they can be resisted with the diversity, I think, that we should be working on, and really kind of that kind of internationalism, not the internationalism of the kind of the globalized imperial machine, so to speak.
Great. Islah, you have thoughts on that?
Just a few idea about, how U.S. interventions, whether in Iraq or in Syria, and European also intervention in Libya, how the infrastructure of the post-independence, political elites were completely destroyed. When we look at Syria or Iraq and the level of education that was given to young girls, and how the level of literacy was almost, bridged. How, now this destruction of basic services, whether at the level of health or education, is now going back at least 30 years or more. So this is affecting, all level of activism. We cannot really talk about women's rights when some basic and fundamental rights to education and health are not available anymore. So this is just one of the aspects that brought back women to suffer from a disease or from lack of education that many struggles, managed to achieve in the post-independence state. So they are bringing us back in time, and in the meanwhile, they have the hypocrisy to claim that we are here to liberate women and give 25% of quota for Iraqi women in the parliament, or 50%, I don't know where. So this is just a very contradictory kind of discourse and total hypocrisy that unfortunately some women's organizations are buying and, doing some activism around. So we shouldn't not look at the bigger picture of how the US intervention and European intervention brought back the region to the beginning of the 20th century, and this conflict of the over the resources and the wealth of the region.
Thank you, Islah. I'm going to jump to one question here, for a couple of questions on Jordan that are coming up, and given
one
that we have
Gaza.
There is also one on Gaza. Okay. Okay. Does anyone want to? Okay, sure. Islah asked for the Gaza. Why not? Go ahead. The question is, can you please say something about the status of women's movement in Gaza? And I think I know why she wanted to have that question asked, which is good, which is really the question of the particular role of, well, there's many things to say there. I'll let Islah take it away.
I was writing, I wrote a paper a few months ago about the two ministries in the West Bank and Gaza. And I concluded in this paper that women are deeply involved in deepening the split between West Bank and Gaza at all levels. And gender was one of the factors that was used to deepen this schism between both areas. So to talk about women's movement in Gaza, we are talking about the General Union of Palestinian Women controlled by Fatah. So many NGOs that almost all agreed with the donors that they will not fund anything related to Hamas in Gaza. So they were in a way complicit with the so-called international community to marginalize the democratically elected Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and Gaza. The same thing happened, of course, in the West Bank, when local councils elected, who won by elected women from the Islamist movement Hamas were boycotted, and they were refused to get any sort of support, whether technical or funding, to run their councils. Going back to the women's movement, so we are talking about the General Union of Palestinian Women, totally under the authority and the control of Fatah organization. Fatah, of course, is actively is very active in marginalizing and weakening the Islamists in Gaza. So we can say that the General Union of Palestinian Women is an exclusive club for nationalist, secularist women in Gaza. We are talking about the Ministry of Women's Affairs when it was under the authority of Hamas, that they tried to reach out to other women's groups, and they were not allowed. They wanted to be part of the coalition of 1325, and they were not allowed. They wanted to be part of the coalition of combating violence, domestic violence or whatever, and they were not allowed. Of course, they wanted to be part of that because it opens up new venues of resources and training for them, but they were not allowed. So the latest is that with the nomination of a new women's minister in the West Bank, who is from Gaza, but very active, you know, in Fatah, the situation was whether to have two ministries in Gaza representing women, one headed by the Palestinian Authority and the other was headed by Hamas. And of course, Hamas decided to dissolve this entity and get the cadre, around 20 cadre, women cadre, to get them, you know, working in other ministries. So we are talking now about a women's movement, if we can talk about a movement that is represented by the General Union of Palestinian Women, which is a very inactive kind of organization, and there's so many NGOs as I described them before.
Great, thank you, Islah. So I'll take the questions to Jordan, to both Nicola and Sara. Curtis Ryan asks about, especially after the 2018 protests in Jordan and the 2019 teachers' strike, to what extent do you think the state's reaction itself has been gendered? And to what extent has the current difficult climate affected women activists even more harshly or more adversely overall? Somebody else, Reem Jabi, also had the question around Jordan. One observation in Jordan is that both men and women who were active during the 90s are not there anymore. Her observation, I'm not sure if it's correct. Where are they now? And where are the men who used to support gender equality? Sara and Nicola, your thoughts?
Should I go first?
Go ahead, Nicola. Go ahead.
Both are good questions. Both are very important questions. I mean, definitely state responses to political activism, state repression is always gendered, and through the history, particularly in Jordan, there's been always a use. You know, Laurie Brand discusses this in her work on Jordan, and Frances Hasso as well on her work on Jordan and Palestine. You know, the use of this norm of female respectability that I talked about earlier as a way of shaming women, of discrediting women's activism. So calling into question women's reputation in order to undermine or discredit her activism. And of course, the teachers' union is a heavily, is made up heavily of women, so the repression of the teachers' union, which I have to be honest, I don't really understand what has gone on exactly, not being able to have been in Jordan recently. But of course, that's going to have, I think, important repercussions for not women's rights activism, but for the activism of those sorts of women in labour movements who are, you know, whose activism is around sort of workplace issues. The issue, where did the men go who support gender equality? I think from my research, there was very few of those men. They were always a minority, and the problem has been that in general, although I think if you go back to the 50s and those radical nationalist movements in the 1950s, women's rights was actually part of the political agendas of those radical nationalist movements. And I think it's also interesting to see how, with the passage of time, women's rights largely disappeared from the political agendas, at least the sort of like political manifestos of political parties. So it just it shows you again just how the idea of sort of progress in women's rights is really problematic, that whole notion, because in many ways political groups in the 1950s had a more radical agenda than, say, groups in the 1990s or early 2000s.
Great. Go ahead, Sara, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Curtis, your question is very, very important because, of course, the state, I mean, on the one hand, the Jordanian state likes to see itself as promoting women's rights, as being, you know, this modern state. But on the other hand, when it comes to protests and suppressing protests, it uses the worst type of gender stereotypes. So in the popular movement, as you know, Curtis, like there's this whole, you know, 2011, 2012, women activists were targeted by the Secret Service, where there were pictures taken of them and then changed and then sent to their parents, telling the parents that they have been like engaged in like sexual activities, like really trying to harass these women activists, getting them out, trying to induce quote unquote honor crimes, etc. And this was actually one of the strategies of the state. And now with the teachers, I mean, the way the female teachers have been targeted as well, in oppressing them, going into women's girls' schools, and then there's the electronic crime law as well, which, you know, you have these trolls kind of harassing certain women's rights activists and also others. I mean, this is about everyone who's kind of in the opposition. But I think this has, especially the electronic crime law, has really pushed women from middle classes and upper middle classes to feel affected themselves, because now they have been, you know, targeted. But I think at the root of it is, of course, this whole, again, this idea of modernity, and the on the one hand, wanting the state wanting to be modern, wanting to be advanced. And one of the big things that the state has used is this idea that, you know, we are modernizing and we're modernizing through our women, but then at the same time, we are modernizing in everything but our women. We are allowing men and to stay real men by allowing, you know, not changing the personal status law, not, you know, because if we change that, you know, this is when the backward people of Jordan would go and, you know, revolt if they weren't allowed. And it goes, and it of course merges into this discourse of, you know, they can't rule themselves, they're not able to be democratic, they are able. So there's, gender plays a very important role here in kind of eliciting certain responses, then saying, see, the general public is backwards, see, they're oppressing women, but then also appeasing and like pushing through everything, but then not pushing through anything in terms of, you know, in terms of gender. And also again here, the women's movement plays into this, because the state has often been very successful in kind of making the, like, you know, Joseph Masad has shown, making the kind of the ruler, the other, the tribal other, the the liberated woman fears the most. So I am worried about this person from the governorate. I'm worried about his patriarchy, his tribalism, and therefore I align myself with the state against this potential patriarchal oppressor. So we really need to be careful, because it's really where discursively things are at.
Great. Okay, we are coming up on 10 minutes to 2 hours of this session going on. So I am very conscious of Zoom fatigue, but with that said, I will try and get 2 more questions into our panelists, those that are as most cross-cutting as possible. The first one is a rather pointed question from Reem Uthman, who says, very great points, very enlightening. My question is, what is the alternative to donors such as the World Bank and other big ones that most NGOs depend on in light of the lack of Arab regional/local funding? If an NGO is able to take the money and design its programs in line with what the context requires with minimal control by the donor, what is the issue with taking the money? Islah.
I think, when we see or examine the funding strategies in our region, we realize that it's impossible to do anything without getting funding. But if we go back, to the history of activism, someone was asking about the history of activism in the Muslim societies. If we go back to the history of activism, the recent history of the Palestinian women's movement, they never got funding from donors, but they managed to do huge kind of, interventions at all levels, whether in refugee camps or in other places. How they were relying on voluntarism, voluntary work and donation from the people. I remember that, we participated many times in making jaddara, very simple kind of dish, and we used to sell it to collect money. And it used to be big money, enabled us to do lots of other things. The same thing, for women in refugee camps in Lebanon. And in the older history, awqaf, this kind of properties donated for the public good was used to do so many other things, hospitals, bridges, public water tapes, sabil, and so many other things. So in our history, whether old or recent, we have so many examples of different kind of activism we used to do, relying on our own financial resources.
Thank you, Islah. Nicola or Sara, any words there? Sara, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think we really, we've been so jailed by this NGOization that we can't think outside it. Why do we need funding? Usually revolutions aren't funded. That doesn't mean that they're easy. Of course you need money, I'm not saying it, but this idea that somebody is going to pay me for me to liberate myself, it doesn't happen like that. And I think we need to get out of this. This is there's a fundamental problem if I'm thinking that I will, in a complex way, but my oppressor is going to give me money so I can then fight against them. No, I'm allowed to do something in a very small way so that the structures stay the way they are. And I think that's a part of the problem. And I think we really need to start thinking outside. We need to discursively think outside this kind of, that it's not about different types of development, but there's an industry there which benefits certain people, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And that industry, the amount of money that actually goes to people in need is minuscule compared to the money that, you know, the expats come and are paid in, you know. So there's a lot, I mean, the very interesting research on, like, you know, how much of, you know, USA dollar, you know, how much of it goes to the supposed person in need, if at all. So I think the important thing is, why do we think that this is something? Liberation, unfortunately, doesn't happen through somebody paying you. It would be great if it did, but it doesn't. So I think we need to rethink it, especially if we're thinking about fighting structures. Thank
you, Sara. Nicola, your work, what would you say to the question that Riem asked?
I think that the way I would look at it is that actually Western aid is it's there to make the West feel better. It's about making the West give this image of moral superiority and enlightenment, when in fact the whole, if you think globally about the way in which you know, the world is structured, and the inequalities within it, so much of those inequalities the root of those are in the emergence of Europe and slavery and colonialism. And, you know, so for me, there's also this sort of cultural discursive element of Western aid. And therefore, if you accept that money, then in a way you're accepting that whole history behind why the West gives that money.
Thank you, Nicola. And our final question for tonight will come from Miriam Awrah, who asked a question that relates to international solidarity between women, gendered class networks, and whether there are examples in your cases that showcase the infrastructure of solidarity across different MENA contexts. I'll start with you, Islah, and then work back to Nicola again. Go ahead.
Of course, in the history of the Palestinian women's movement, we can talk about lots of solidarity with international groups, whether in the Democratic Union of Women, and Palestinian women in solidarity with other women played a major role in Mexico City Conference, Women's Conference in 1975 to condemn Zionism as a form of racism. And women managed to do that and to influence public opinion at that time. In Nairobi too, solidarity group with the Palestinian women were something very old and very efficient at many levels. But unfortunately, after Oslo, this solidarity was weakened. It showed a bit of strength during the first Palestinian uprising, 87, 90, 91. But after that, I can say that it was a bit weakened. There are other forms of solidarity between women, I could say at the official level, within the women's organization belonging to the Arab League. And even though we are laughing at that, but sometimes, you know, when it comes to legal reforms or influencing policies, sometimes it is useful to rely on another example in another Arab country that is similar to us, and they changed their policies or they changed their laws. But I think we have a weak point when it comes to be in solidarity with other groups, especially in the South. We have managed through the BDS movement to re-establish contact with women in South Africa and in Cuba and in other parts of the world, but it is not as the movement, the solidarity movement during the 80s and the 70s.
Great. Sara, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I was thinking this is I mean, I have to do much more research to actually be able to answer it properly. I mean, we have some people with us like Abdulrazak Takriti who can speak to this much more. I mean, the things that are coming to mind now, I know there is work right now being done between, like I said, Black Lives Matter and Native American activists and Palestinian activists. I haven't done the research. I actually don't know the details. But I also know, for example, in Jordan, I know that independent media outlets, and Islah Jad was here earlier, have been doing a lot of great work across Jordan, Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon, working together, trying to kind of bring out voices. Musawa is doing this in terms of kind of gender and Islam across the Islamic world and the diaspora, and bringing together. So there, and of course, like Islah just said, BDS, but there, I'm sure there's more. But it's a great question.
Yeah. I'm going to give the last word to you, Nicola, particularly because your book, which just came out, deals with the question of embodying geopolitics, and as well. So it's both temporal as well as geographical, and the question had to do with international solidarities. So take it away.
I think Islah and Sara have both touched on the main things that I would point to, which is that, of course, during the, let's say, the heyday of third world solidarity, there was a lot of solidarity between activists, you know, sort of look at the 70s, 60s, 70s, even in the 50s at the state level. So we see lots of examples of solidarity, and also not just, I guess that also the solidarity had a very important performative effect within sort of non-aligned movements, you know, their claims to legitimacy as well. And obviously what we see now across the Arab region since the end of the Cold War, if not before, is you know, what Vijay Prashad calls the end of the third world. I mean, the third world solidarity is no longer a political project in the way that it was. But obviously, you know, Islah and Sara both mentioned other types of examples of solidarity. I think there's a real challenge, though, to break down the geopolitical barriers between people within the region, between the region and other parts of the world. So, you know, I don't want to end on a negative point, though, but let's say there's a lot of you can point to a lot of instances within the region where there is actually, instead of solidarity, there's actually competition for resources, or there are geopolitical considerations that are not just state considerations, but are also very much tied up with people's subjectivities. You know, we only have to think about, for example, the way in which the Kurdish struggle has been sort of completely sidelined, I think, in a lot of the solidarity, other types of solidarity in the region. So, I mean, that's maybe spinning it in a rather negative way to end the seminar, sorry. But thank you for everybody's really great questions, and I'm sorry that we've not been able to answer everything.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank all of our panelists tonight who were able to provide a very detailed, nuanced, informative, analytical discussion. And again, I'd also like to apologize to those who may have asked questions. It's obviously quite a difficult thing to do it with 3 different people with such a short amount of time. I did my best, and hopefully, but I believe the discussion sort of really brought out a lot of interesting stuff. So thank you as well as audience members. You're also participants. I now hand off to Dr. Carol Palmer, who is the head of the Council for British Research in the Levant, to sign us off. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Dr. Tawfiq Haddad, for your wonderful chairing, and this has been a real pleasure and my highlight, I think, actually, of 2021 so far. So thank you all for such a totally engrossing 2 hours. It's really been very wonderful, and I know Nicola, I have the pleasure to know Nicola Pratt and Sara Ababneh, but for me it's been a particular pleasure to be to see and meet, albeit digitally, Dr. Islah Jad. So thank you so much for all of your contributions and really thought-provoking. It's raised, I'm going to think about this for a very long time. And I'd also like to again thank all of the audience who've been with us and those who particularly stayed with us to this point. Thank you very much, everybody. And it's traditionally, I would now say, please join our mailing list. Please, please stay in touch and watch out for future events. We've been quite blown away by the response to this one, and we hope to follow up in future. Thank you again to everybody. So good night, stay safe, stay well.